territorial acknowledgements. And with all that, I'd like to acknowledge that all of us are located on various, all the different traditional lands across our province of BC. I'm on Clements territory, and located this area is called Switsmalt. And I just like to acknowledge the territories that are here and the Secwepemc peoples who have taken care of this land and their unceded traditional and ancestral territories that are here.
Okay.
Great, thanks.
So today we have two speakers, the first of which is Nancy Clements. And Nancy is with Island Health, the regional healthy built environment team out there. She is a certified public health inspector. Like many of us on the call, started off in that area, working predominantly in rural and remote communities, focusing on drinking water and land use. And most recently, she's been working with supporting public health work around drinking water and around the impacts of drought, as well as working with local governments to support inclusion of health and climate change into community and land use plan. So today, Nancy is going to be speaking to us about water systems and the need for a holistic approach. So Nancy, take it away. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. And Shrito has kindly offered to navigate the technology for me because I'm over 40. So I'm sometimes challenged in this world. So thank you to Shrito for queuing those up for me. So as Peter mentioned, I am the Healthy Built Environment Consultant with Island Health. And so my roots very much are in drinking water and land use. So I come to this role with that baseline public health perspective. So next slide. So I do want to acknowledge that I am joining you today from the traditional territories of the Coast Salish, the Nuu-chah-nulth, and the Kwakwaka'wakw nations across the region. And Anita always gives me things to ponder with these acknowledgements. And one of the things that struck me was how we need to change our perspective around drinking water and stop treating it like a commodity that's bought and sold and consumed, and sort of embrace what our medical health officer, Dr. Shannon Waters, speaks of as treating it as a relative. So as a family member, you know, you take care of each other, and how do we change our relationship with water to be more reflective of that? So next slide. So the role of the health authority, so we come to our drinking water role in a very firm regulatory way. So we do regulate drinking water systems that have more than one connection. We are responsible for ensuring that ensuring water quality. So not necessarily water quantity, but ensuring that the water that is provided to people is potable and safe to drink. And within that legislation, it outlines the requirements for water system operators. So there's all sorts of requirements and includes things like training, minimum treatment and disinfection levels, emergency response planning, and all those different facets. So next slide. So what are the impacts of drought on our drinking water systems? So there's the obvious and very extreme example of the reduction of or complete loss of our source. So obviously that's sort of the catastrophic potential. But as we get to that point, we start to see impacts of drought even before we get to that point. So we're starting to see issues around the deterioration in the source water quality. So we're starting to see, you know, systems that historically haven't had, you know, really, you know, bad water results in their raw water are starting to see counts of total coliforms and E. coli. We are also seeing some deterioration of distribution water quality. So, you know, in extreme cases where systems start to depressurize, the sediment within the distribution system gets stirred up. So we start seeing counts. We're seeing increases in water temperature. So the warmer the water temperature, the more habitable it is for bacteria to grow and live. And there's always issues as well around allocation. So in times of significant scarcity, how do we allocate that limited resource for the most pressing need? So next slide. So what are the impacts of drought? So as we all know, water is essential for health and sanitation. But there's also the issues around water use restrictions and reductions. So how is that impacting people's ability to live and, you know, have the fulsome life that we all want to see? There's financial impacts. So if we have to start changing allocation, how is that going to financially impact some of those water users? There's the potential reduction in fire protection capacity. And there's huge impacts to our food security and agricultural industries. So being able to produce food and have those really robust high yields, you know, we need to have that water for irrigation. There's also the mental health impact. There's a lot of stress involved when we start looking at scarcity and allocation issues. And there's always the secondary impacts. And for us in British Columbia, you know, that usually translates to things like wildfire events. So next slide, please. So we need to start looking at building resilience within our water systems. So when we talk about building resilience, one of the first things we need to start doing is normalizing the conversation around conservation. We have historically, in most regions, had plenty of water, and it's not something we've ever had to really think about, but we need to start shifting our thinking and having that conversation. And this goes for both sides, because typically when you say water conservation, people automatically think, well, I'll take a shorter shower, or, you know, I'll do some other sort of things within my household to reduce water use. But there's strategies on both sides of water systems to look at conservation. So the supply side as well as the demand side. So next slide. So we also need to have careful consideration needs to occur around the densification around high risk areas. So I know there's a lot of strategies now to densify housing, but we need to be really thoughtful about really asking those tough questions. Is there enough water to support this densification? Because without water, you've lost that baseline public health need, and you know you're putting population at risk. So how do we have really thoughtful development in areas that have the necessary resources to support that population, and understanding those big picture impacts? So you know when we look at water systems, we're kind of looking at this small little piece, but the complexity around water is very broad scoped. We also have to look at the recovery potential. So there's a lot of issues around snowpack in the region, and what's the potential for aquifer recharge. So are we getting enough precipitation over the winter months to recharge those aquifers, or are they constantly getting drawn down and not having the opportunity to replenish? And there's compounding risk. So depending on the region in which you live, you know, for us being a coastal region, we are looking at what the risks are around saltwater intrusion. So if our aquifers are getting depleted and not recharging over the winter, but those pumps in those wells continue to draw down that aquifer, what are the risks of saltwater intrusion happening into those coastal aquifers and further, you know, reducing the amount of potable water that we can supply? So next slide. So when we look at system design, so obviously we have systems that are already existing, so we're needing to look at how do we build resilience there. But when we build new systems, we need to be really thoughtful and ensure that, you know, the design of that system is more resilient to our extreme weather impacts. So although today we're talking about drought, there's a lot of different facets that we should be considering around flooding, freezing, extreme heat, all these different things. So are there ways we can design systems now, knowing what we know, to be more resilient moving into the future? But when we look at drought, some of the strategies, you know, for water systems and connections to that water system is looking at opportunities for new construction of homes to be plumbed with the purple pipes so that they can have, rainwater collection off the roof for their non-potable water needs like toilet flushing or laundry. Mandating or requiring low flow or high efficiency fixtures within the home. Having the capacity for rain barrels or that rainwater catchment. And, moving forward, looking at how do we start looking at gray water recycling? What are the requirements? How do we make that a feasible option? The next slide. So we also need to look at further building resilience and start having those community-wide conversations around the value of water. So, when we look at how we use water, obviously, we have our human health and, impacts and needs, but we also have to look at what's the food production happening within our communities, what's the recreation value, and what are the industrial needs. So, water has a lot of value in a lot of different ways, and this is where that uncomfortable conversation around allocation occurs. So when we have a limited amount of this valuable water, how do we make sure we're trying to maximize its use and that everybody is getting what we need to thrive and survive? So next slide. So within the health authority, we have expanded the mandate to address the impacts of climate change and health. So this obviously still includes issues around water, for example, drought. So next slide. And those of you within the healthy built environment realm are probably familiar with the social determinants of health. So when we look at these, there's a lot of different ways we can work the conversation around drought and water into that, the neighborhood and built environment and the social and community content. So next slide. So when we look at those other values of water, sometimes, people kind of lose a little bit of sight of the big picture. So, people will complain that, they can't water their lawns, but the farm down the road is irrigating. But the value of that irrigation is we now have food security in our region. So, understanding the different uses and impacts. So there's also, issues around public swimming pools and spray parks. So sometimes communities really grapple with the conversation around, well, should we still be running the spray park when we're, at a certain level of water restriction? But how do we quantify and value the social connectedness of having that public space for people to go to because they can't do, fill up their kiddie pool in the backyard? So having that public space to go to and connect with other people from the neighborhood is really valuable. And the other piece is when we have these extreme heat events, that's also a cooling opportunity. So, those people who may not have air conditioning, this is an opportunity for them to go and have a place to cool off. And there's also the conversation around community parks and playing fields. So, watering those spaces so that those playing fields can be used, there's a lot of value in that recreation and social connection. So these are really hard conversations. There's no easy answer, but this is something that communities have to grapple with to understand and, figure out and allocate, when the resources is limited, how do we value that? So next slide. So when we look at our public health response to drought, there's a lot of different facets that we're considering when we look at the impacts of drought on health. So there's the obvious, because we have that regulatory role, the improving the drinking water system resilience. So there's a lot of work that we're doing in that realm around supporting the development of emergency response and contingency plans and having those conversations with community around conservation and, sort of those different facets. We are looking at options for increasing water use efficiency. So again, how do we make the most and reduce loss within the system? Safeguarding recreational water. So obviously, you know, as our, you know, surface water supplies start to get depleted, you know, we start to see, you know, the potential for, you know, bacterial counts to start going up. And how do we make sure that, you know, that these recreational spots are still available for people to use and enjoy? We're looking at the opportunities around increased disease surveillance and air quality monitoring and alerts. Obviously, we're a little concerned about, you know, an increase in those dust-borne diseases and, you know, how do we look for these emerging diseases in the population so that we can make sure that we're making informed decisions, and also managing the mental health impacts. There's a lot of stress associated with this. So, you know, how do we make sure that we identify and support that moving forward? So next slide. So how are we going to get success moving forward? So the one thing that I've really learned working through this process is there's a lot of different people that have a vested interest and a passion and work in the world of drinking water and water as a whole in our ecosystems. So having all these people come together at the table and everybody bring their little piece of the puzzle is where we're going to get that success. You know, acknowledging that other people have, you know, different perspectives and having those conversations is, I think, where we're going to get our biggest success. And last slide. So as I said, working together is where we're going to get those strategies and successes, and it's exciting work moving forward, and really privileged to have the opportunity to do this. Thank you for the time this morning to share my work with you.
So I'd like to introduce Raf Shea, and he's going to be presenting about drought emergencies and long-term impacts and what they've been learning on the Sunshine Coast. And so Raphael is the manager of sustainable development at the beautiful Sunshine Coast Regional District, where he's been working on questions of water and climate since 2015. He works at the nexus of entrepreneurial projects and innovative policy. Raf has a Bachelor of Philosophy in Interdisciplinary Leadership Studies from the University of New Brunswick and a Master's in Environment and Management at Royal Roads University. Raf also enjoys gardening, biking, skiing, and foraging the mountains for mushrooms with his family. So it's a great introduction. And please take it away. I'm really looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Anita. And thanks everybody for being here. I'm just going to share my screen and switch to presenter mode here. So I don't see your faces, but I've got quite a bit. Well, I've got quite a bit of content to cover, so we'll probably swing through the climate pieces pretty quickly, and then get into the water and the drought pieces more. So I'm going to assume people are familiar with the climate stuff. And yeah, we've been dealing with this for a few years. I always tell our community when we started seeing these impacts of drought, our plans are all set up to accommodate these drought events. It's just they were planning for these realities to be so far in the future. So I always felt that we were in the forefront of climate impacts, and now everybody's in the same boat. So that does give us an advantage. Just a little bit of context. This is the graph from the latest 6th assessment report from the IPCC. I'm sure you've all seen it. I just want to point out that we're continuing on these little black dots. We're not on the right course, and the impacts that we're seeing with drought are going to get a lot worse unless we change the trajectory pretty quickly. Our adaptive capacity is already being strained, and it's going to get strained further. And the safe operating space right now is dependent on a massive amount of direct carbon removal, which in itself is still something that I'm still trying to wrap my head around as somebody who's been working on this for too long. So yeah, a few years ago, we did a risk assessment, a climate risk assessment, and obviously increased temperatures and drought putting strain on the water system came up front and center. And to give you a sense of how we've been dealing with it, the red squares are stage 4. And you can see that in 2015 with that early snow melt we had, I don't know if everybody remembers, that's when we had our first stage 4 then. And we've been in stage 3 or stage 4 every year since. So our community is regularly facing pretty dramatic watering restrictions. And in terms of those hard conversations, having them early and often and with a lot of people, we've been having that conversation for almost 10 years, and it's been going on for years before then as well, because we have a pretty engaged citizenry on this question of water. So I'd say we have a relatively high water literacy, and this has obviously increased that. But we're not all on the same page, and there's definitely a lot of tension, especially when we have to make these calls. The other thing I want to flag is in terms of drought and climate change, this is the PCIC projections for summer precipitation on the Sunshine Coast. And the blue dots are lived experience. So you can see these 3 little dots in the bottom. There's a little arrow because our water precipitation was so low, it's not even on our graph. We had essentially had almost 0. So we're in a state now where we're passing threshold events and we're entering nonlinear change. And a lot of our adaptation and resilience building and community conversations are built on small incremental changes that we can envision and imagine and start to talk about how we're going to adapt to. But I think we are passing threshold events. We're into nonlinear change. In 7, almost 8 of the last 12 years, we've passed the worst case projections for the 90th percentile in 2050. So the way that we have to approach these questions is really at thinking about the extremes, not that median black line, because the extremes are happening on an almost yearly basis now. I like how Nancy called it the secondary. Oh, and it's not just us, it's everywhere. You know, everybody's facing drought right now. South Africa, every country in Central Africa has been declaring states of emergency. There's going to be real big issues there. Barcelona, where the Catalonia water reservoir, they've electroshocked every fish in that lake. It was so low that it was getting anaerobic and all the fish were about to die. So in order to save water in one of the biggest tourist cities of the world, Barcelona, they've taken all the life out of their main lake to try to save water and make sure that those fish don't just die and contaminate the water. So these secondary, as Nancy was framing it, the secondary impacts, well, there's increased heat is also directly correlated to the drought. This is from the 6th assessment report, so it's a little bit more accurate data. We're going to have more frequent and intense heat waves and higher temperatures. My daughters are in a little cross-country ski program that got canceled this year because our ski hill didn't have enough snow. So a lot of our questions here that we're starting to explore is how is demand and elasticity going to change with water as temperature increases? And we're trying to dissociate our stage restrictions or these other external variables from that core demand to see how the correlation to heat is behaving, and then how we can better project future water demand, especially as our community grows. So we got some very sophomoric exercises on that front. If anybody's got a PhD or a master's thesis wanting to dive into it, we're always open there. There's also the vulnerability of the extreme heat. The number of over 30 degree days in our area is going to increase quite dramatically because we're not following that emissions scenario for the green line. We're following closer to the red line here. You all know this stuff. The wildfire, we all know on the health advisories, the clean air. The strain biodiversity, I'll come back to it a little bit later, but one of our main cooling avenues, especially when our splash pads and our pools are closed, is the beaches of the Sunshine Coast. And during the heat dome, all the filter feeders died and our beaches got closed. So our main adaptation measure, which is go jump in the ocean, was no longer an alternative for people dealing with not a lot of water and a lot of heat. And you can see the ocean temperatures are just skyrocketing right now. They've totally decoupled from the 50, 40-year trend. This is also, I'll come back to this, but there's a geotechnical, when the cedars are all dying and the rain, when it does come, gets more intense, it creates a lot of geotechnical concerns. So here I just have a little slide to try to keep us on the positive note. I do believe that we have the opportunity to create the world we live in, and the stories we tell have a lot of power. So we can tell a lot of stories that are pretty depressing and pretty scary, but I do believe in our collective will and collective power to create a better world that's got good social conditions and good planetary health. So now I'll dive a little bit into the water system at the SCRD to create some context for the state of emergency that we had in 2022, and then some lesson learned out of that. So you can see the SCRD manages a bunch of different water systems. The main one is the Chapman, this orange blob here. But this pink one, South Pedder Harbor, is based on a small lake, and with the droughts that we've been having, that lake is not replenishing, so it's, for the first time, is going into water restrictions. Eastbourne, this little purple one on Keats Island down here, all the people there have a water tank, and they just get a few hours a week to fill up their water tank. They've been water rationing forever. So that's another place where we're trying to spend some energy. But obviously, most of our energy is where most of the population is on Chapman system. There's Chapman Lake and Edwards Lake that feed into this water treatment plant. And then we're increasingly depending on groundwater in the Gibsons area. Gibsons is its own water system, which is also sharing the same groundwater systems, or the groundwater aquifer. The way the system works is we have these two lakes in a Class A provincial park, and there's remote controlled, satellite controlled weirs on both of those lakes that we can open and close a valve, and then it takes about 12 hours for the water to flow down all the way to the water treatment plant. There's another dam here with a point of diversion. So our utility operators are very versed in trying to predict the weather 12, 24 hours away so that they can control the valve and really save every single drop. Yeah, in the summer, our operators are working 24 hours a day to try to just do these micro adjustments. Obviously, the situation of drought is not really there in the wintertime. There's lots of rain in the winter. The issue is in the summer when the rains don't come, because we just need one good rain a month and we would be good. But our demand also in the summer increases. So what are we doing about it? Well, we finally put all these little pieces together in a cohesive water strategy. And this is, every one of these boxes is one to many studies and reports and plans with a ton of people behind them. I've got to give credit to the huge team that's behind here and the amount of energy that's been put into every single areas here. But there's the water supply expansion. There's a ton of projects there. There's the water infrastructure. And right now we've got a big fire flow issue if you've been reading the news. There's water efficiency, which is a big area for using the water we do have better. And then there's source water protection, which we're only kind of starting on. We've got some work, obviously, that's regulatory from the health authorities, but there's a lot more that we could be doing on that front. So a lot of the foundation of how we understand our water situation at the SCRD is through this water demand analysis. So we've created an understanding, a model of our watershed where we get most of the water, and created a theoretical model for how much demand we need, how much water we actually need in a case where we don't have water restrictions beyond stage 2. That's the key thing, is people are tired of going to stage 3 and stage 4. So we want to really try to avoid that. And that's the policy directive that we're framing everything around. So on the demand side, there's risk tolerance. You know, what kind of levels of service are people willing to pay for and willing to accept? So right now we've defined that as stage 2 restrictions. There's also the hydrological modeling. So right now at the bottom here, this Chapman watershed is based on a theoretical understanding of how much water we get from the watershed. There's a lot of improvements we can do to this model. And again, because the climate models are so linear and we're in a non-linear state right now, what we've done here is we've combined the worst case 2015 spring drought with 2017, 2018 fall droughts. And then we put those two worst case scenarios together to create a worst case scenario. What happened in 2022 is it totally shattered the fall drought scenario and went well into winter. So now we're just wrestling with, you know, what's this worst case scenario we actually have to plan for? Is it a 180-day drought or is it a 300-day drought? That's what we're trying to figure out now to better understand that baseline number that's going to guide how much water we have to develop. And one question that I do pose is it'd be great to have this consistently across the area. The province is looking at downscaling climate risk assessments and climate modeling, so hopefully that helps in creating some common understanding across the area, especially as there's more of a push towards climate disclosure and climate risk and the costs associated with that in our financial statements. If we're not using all the same baseline, then our ability to borrow money will be impacted unequally down the road. One of the key things we're doing is the water restrictions. I've brought this up a couple times. I just think it's interesting. They've been here since the 1970s, since the SCRD was created as a water purveyor. So people think sometimes it's new, but it's not new. We've been talking about this forever, all of us. Demand management. Another key thing that we're trying to do is water metering. So we've just started the final phase of meter installations, but we have quite a few meters already in the ground and parts of the system. And one thing that we've realized is that 11% of the residential accounts use 40% of the water. Let's just say that again. A very small number of people use almost half of the water. Now, this is partly these mega leaks that are using 100,000 liters a day, but those are getting fixed. There's not too many of those anymore because we can find them with the water metering program. So this is a lot of the education and the targeted engagement that we're doing now is, okay, what's going on? You all know that we're about to run out of water in a lot of the summers, so we're trying to work with these people. And then this is some of the engagement that we're doing more targeted. So we've got hundreds of people now signed up for a monthly email with specific information about their water use patterns, how it situates with the context of the average residential water user. You can see, you know, in the summer, we're using over 1,000 liters a day per residence, and in the winter, it's just over 400. So people have these constant information feedback mechanisms that we're really working hard on not just increasing the water literacy, but also the action planning that can come with that. Supply expansion. I just wanted to give you a sense of the quantity of projects that are happening. And then this little red box on the side here there's a bunch of noise. So we've got a bunch of people working really hard to try to get us more water, and they're getting constantly bombarded by other fires and other emergencies and other crises. The latest one is we have a fire flow issue where a lot of our areas, the pressure in the pipes isn't quite high enough for these new higher density multi-unit residential buildings. So there's that whole new conversation that's happening right now. But yeah, anyways, there's a ton. We have multiple rounds of groundwater exploration. We've had a Chapman Lake expansion project that's been in the works since the early 2000s, and it got canceled in 2018. That would have been the most affordable option, but there was some we didn't get a provincial permit for doing works in the provincial park. The big one is the Grantham's well field, or the Church Road well field, was completed, and that's a huge. It'll cut the supply deficit by about 50%, which is really a huge win. And I'll get into some of these other projects in the actual emergency scenario. Another key thing is working with nature. This is just a kind of a scan of everywhere, all the different plans and documents that talk about working with nature. So we have drought-tolerant landscaping guidelines, and with the increase in multi-unit residential buildings, you can do landscaping plans through a DPA. So that's a regulatory tool that can support drought tolerance. There's the biodiversity work that we're working with the Coastal Douglas Fir Conservation Partnership through some mapping there. And this is a little snippet of a heat map for habitat connectivity and animal migration. But those similar things could be integrated with resilience on the hydrological system. We just completed an extreme heat resilience plan, and it has a whole section on working with nature to try to create more shading, and that has a lot of co-benefits. On the energy performance side, there's working with nature there. We're going to be starting a natural asset initiative to do some mapping as part of our OCP updates. And obviously, Town of Gibsons is doing a ton of monitoring through its world-class leadership on natural assets, especially as it relates to groundwater. And then we've got a Fire Smart plant database, which includes a little column for drought tolerance. So there's a ton of multi-solving opportunities with these areas. And this is just one example where multi-solving is also being mentioned in every single one of these realms, not just in the water documents. It's been brought up a couple times, the drought and agriculture. I brought up this this map here of the zoning, and you can see this pale green and the darker green AG zone is the ag zones. We don't have a lot of agriculture on the Sunshine Coast, but these are the good spots of land to drink water or for growing food. They happen to be areas where we're now going to start water metering, so they're moving towards paying a volumetric rate for water, which is not necessarily part of our business plan. And additionally, they're also in the recharge area for the main groundwater source for both the Gibsons water system and for the Chapman water system. So there's a tension there. Under the Water Sustainability Act, you have to demonstrate what's the maximum sustainable yield of the aquifer. We've spent years and quite a bit of money to get a number that would give us a water license for our Grantham's Well field water system. These little farms that are going to be tapping in the same aquifer may not have the resources to do that. And in all likelihood, the water purveyors are already using all the water for the maximum sustainable yield of that aquifer. So I don't know if they're going to be able to secure water rights to get themselves off of the municipal water system. And if they stay on the municipal water system, they have to start paying a volumetric rate. So there's a huge tension right now around the viability of agriculture on the Sunshine Coast. And then in parallel to that, because it's an outdoor water use and we are going to stage 4 regularly, they're getting restricted. So they actually lose access to their water many summers, and then that's a livelihood issue. So I'll just quickly go through our state of local emergency in 2022. Essentially what happened is the fall rains didn't come. So in 2015, we had this situation where we're about to fly in these massive siphons with the helicopter in a Class A provincial park that goes 250 meters downstream. And the rains came the day we were about to fly up. In 2017, the rains didn't come, so we installed them. And we've been using these emergency siphons at Chapman Lake ever since. In 2022, the snow came and it froze before the lake could recharge. So that's why we were no longer able to control the valve, and the siphons, we were afraid of it freezing. So we were no longer able to supply water into the creek. So just to say, these emergency systems, and then we ended up installing a siphon in Edwards Lake in 2022 as well. They take months or years to plan, and when you need them, it's all hands on deck to actually get it commissioned. So it really is a reason to just get your planning going ahead. Think about these scenarios where you're going to run out of water. because what we did in 2022 is we hired the best-in-class water modeling to know when the rains were going to come and how much water we were going to have so that we can start initiating other contingency plans. And the best they can do is 3 days. The problem with all these other contingency plans is that they take more than 3 days to implement. So, for example, we had the province hired KPMG supply chain logistics experts to help us out. So we had it all lined out. So what happens if we commandeer every single water tanker in the lower mainland? Well, that takes more than 3 days to implement, and it wasn't enough to meet our water needs. Plus, we would have to shut down the highway in terms of trucking the water back and forth. Then we had explored the concept of segmenting the water system. So we just have to sacrifice one zone to either a boil water advisory until there's no more water in that one zone, and then keep the groundwater systems going. So then the trucking of the water could just help supply this one part of the system. We had a bunch of work looking at massive barges that we could then fill with water bottles from Metro Vancouver area onto the Sunshine Coast, and what the distribution of that would be and where the drop-off locations would be. One of the pain points that we had during the emergency was the familiarity with the system. We had a bunch of external provincial resources and supply chain experts come in, but they didn't know the land. They were all from Vancouver, from Alberta, and there's some really simple logistical things that ended up wasting quite a bit of time. So if you ever come faced with these situations, make sure that there's a lot of time spent to training, especially in emergencies where that's not necessarily seen as a high value, because the implicit knowledge is rarely explicit. Another thing that we learned was the purveyor's responsibilities continue even in a state of local emergency. So that included the schools. So at the last minute, we were learning that we had to include all the logistics of bottled water distribution and sanitation for toilets in every single schools, because they weren't going to shut down. So that was a whole other sidebar of logistical figuring out. In the end, we never ran out of water, but it was quite close a few times. And unfortunately, because every one of these contingency plans takes more than 3 days and they're quite expensive, so people get gun shy, right? Like, you don't want to spend all this staff time and money initiating a contingency plan that you won't need. The only one other option that was left for us was the harmful habitat, or the habitat alteration and destruction application with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So we have an environmental flow need on Chapman Creek to maintain water at a certain level for salmon. And this is my daughter. Just last year, there was so many salmon. You kind of see it in the top here. This dark mass is hundreds of salmon in Chapman Creek in 2023. It's absolutely magical. But unfortunately, that was our only option left. So we applied to the federal government for the option of just cutting the creek off of water and sacrificing the ecosystem. And that...
Brad,
yeah.
Sorry, it's Anita. I'm just letting you know, we're into the question and answer period, and we got about 3 minutes to the end, and some people might have to leave at 10:30. So just letting you know.
Yeah, this is the final piece here. Like, the main tool at our disposal in the framework is you have to prioritize human health over animals. And that's really hard it was hard on me personally to get to that point where that was our only option. And a few times we came to within hours of having to make this call. We had another storm event, another local emergency that happened also during the drought emergency, where one of the water systems lost all its systems. So we had to then give water to that other water improvement area. So a couple lessons learned: don't let a good crisis go to waste. There's so much money and resources going to emergency management. I'm really curious about how we can make that resilience and climate. And with that mental health piece, don't forget your moorings. What is it that gives you joy and keeps you going, especially when we're dealing with hard questions like drought? Always happy to chat about this. Thanks. Oh, and here's my contact. Yeah, if you want to ever give me a shout.